All right, in this final section of Chapter 11, we're going to look at how we can explain short-run variations in inflation. So, in a growing economy, the explanation for persistent inflation is that aggregate demand rises more quickly than long-run aggregate supply increases, right? So we've already seen this in the last chapter, right? So this is a recap. Short-run variations in inflation, however, can be the result of both demand and supply factors. It's not purely demand-driven like we saw in the classical model in the last chapter. Okay, so we basically have, in the short run, two different types of inflation. We have demand pull inflation and we have cost push inflation in the short run, potentially. What is demand pull inflation? This is inflation that's caused by increases in aggregate demand that aren't matched by increases in aggregate supply. Okay, so this is why it's called demand pull inflation. It's being driven by aggregate demand. Now this is opposed to cost push inflation, which is basically caused by the short-run aggregate supply curve. And cost push inflation is caused by decreases in short-run aggregate supply. All right, so here we see cost push inflation. Short-run aggregate supply decreases, and this pushes prices up. And at the same time, we get a recession. But this is not, don't confuse this with a recessionary gap. A recessionary gap comes from a decrease in aggregate demand that causes prices to go down. Okay, so there is a recession, but we don't refer to this as a recessionary gap. Now, what if a nation and their economy were to experience both of these things at the same time? So an increase in aggregate demand and a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. Well, as it turns out, the result would be unambiguous on price level. There would, without a doubt, be an increase in the price level because both of these things are causing inflation. But GDP could go up, it could go down. It just depends on which of these shifts more, whether demand shifts more or aggregate supply shifts more. Okay, so in terms of aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the open economy, right, an economy where we trade with other countries, recall that one of the reasons the aggregate demand curve slopes downward is because of the open economy, right? The open economy effect, net exports. And so remember, so this is a recap, remember that when the domestic price level here in our country goes up, we as U.S. citizens want to buy cheaper goods from foreign countries, right? So when our prices go up, it makes foreign goods relatively cheaper, and we want to sort of switch over to that. But the opposite happens when our prices here in the U.S. go down, right? That makes foreign goods relatively more expensive, and so we'd rather buy our own stuff and buy fewer imports from other countries. Recall also that the dollar has an impact on trade as well in the open economy. So when our dollar becomes weaker against other currencies, it makes their currency stronger. Well, that basically makes our stuff cheaper for them, and it makes their stuff more expensive. So what does this mean in terms of shifting curves? It causes an inward shift to the left of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, because a lot of our inputs for production come from other countries. And so if our dollar gets weaker, we can't buy as much of those foreign inputs. So it shifts the supply curve to the left. This causes real equilibrium GDP to fall, and it also causes the price level to fall. And this tends to cause employment to decrease, so it increases unemployment, and it also contributes to inflation. So again, this would be cost push inflation as a result of a weaker dollar. Okay, so this is what it would look like. So this is actually the opposite. So this is the case where we have a stronger dollar. So an increase in the value of our dollar means that the cost of inputs goes down, right? Cost of inputs gets cheaper, those inputs from other countries. And as the cost of inputs gets cheaper, that increases aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply. And if we're assuming that aggregate demand stays the same, that leads to a decrease in price. Price goes down, and real GDP goes up. On top of that, an increase in the value of the dollar reduces net exports. Okay, so this is a demand side effect of the change in the value of the dollar. So since our dollar gets more valuable, it makes it harder for foreigners to buy our stuff. And so it causes a decrease in the demand for our goods from foreigners. So aggregate demand decreases, which brings price down and real GDP down.